In this video, we're going to start discussing Act 1 of the play The Tempest by Shakespeare. In our in-class discussions, we've already gone over some Shakespeare reading tips and some approaches to help you read through this play. In the online edition of this work, you do have the, let's say, modern transliteration. As well as the original Shakespearean English. And I'd like you to continue to try to grapple with both of them. Use that Shakespearean text as the basis for your readings, referring over to the modern or contemporary transliteration only to supplement your understanding. I know that it's hard, obviously, it's difficult for all of us to grapple with Shakespeare, but as you familiarize yourself with it, as you force yourself to work through the text and wrest meaning from it, you will improve. It will become easier for you. It's eminently helpful for you to be able to engage with the text in its original language because so much of the meaning is embedded in the words themselves, in the structures and the specific word choices that Shakespeare lays out for us. And almost all of that is lost in the transition into contemporary English. Shakespeare is as much of a master of language as he is a master of character, and grappling with him or engaging with him on the levels of language as much as on the level of character is incredibly important for us in our attempt to interpret him and understand him. This first video is going to lay out some of the historical background details necessary for us to understand the Tempest. Now, before I begin to discuss it, I do want to offer one caveat. Post-colonial readings of this text are quite popular. In the end, as we'll discuss through much of the introductory portion of this video, this is a tale about the New World. And it is incredibly tempting for contemporary critics to read this text and the characters within it as being a kind of allegory for the New World. And it's true, there is a degree of truth to that. However, the direction of post-colonial criticism has presented to us, in my view, an incredibly reductive vision of good and evil. Shakespeare is typically not a man who presents to us spectacles of individuals who lack complexity, who are morally good or morally evil wholly. Rather, he recognizes the inherent complexity of all human nature, and it is that complexity that actually renders us human. It's definitional. Our capacity for wide and varied passions, both for good and ill, make us human beings. So, as we look at characters like Prospero or Caliban, we may be inclined, based on, let's say, what you've read in online resources or summaries, or from a kind of surface initial reading, a kind of visceral initial response to the characters in the presentation, to judge these characters harshly or kindly. However, I would caution you against embracing that initial inclination. These characters are as complex as any that Shakespeare has ever presented. We should try, or we should strive to stand against that initial inclination to condemn them wholesale based on partial information. Oftentimes, when we see a character or when we meet a person for the first time, we only gain a vague impression of that individual. Even though it feels like we understand who they are, we construct this mental picture of who they are. That seems to dominate much of our interpretation and provide us with a kind of conceptual framework to understand, or at least believe we understand, who this person is. It's incumbent upon us to actually interrogate that character's actions and build a more robust perspective on the identity of that individual. It's true in real life, where initial impressions can oftentimes sour us or incorrectly incline us towards a person. And it's also true in fiction. Sometimes characters like Prospero and Caliban will come across as either malicious or slavish. By the end of this play, I will hope to have convinced you that as characters' motivations and potentials are revealed to us, that these reductive or initial perspectives are actually meant to be overturned. Prospero, unlike what you might read, is not some simple reductive vision of a colonizer, nor is Caliban the poor and oppressed slave who is being imported or who is being oppressed in this new land. With respect to historical background, this play was inspired by an original source. In the summer of 1609, an English sea vessel, a mariner's ship, the Sea Venture, which was en route to the New World carrying colonists and, supplies, was wrecked. The ship was caught up in a massive tempestuous storm, and the crew were marooned on islands in the Bermudas. Eventually, they were rediscovered and they were brought back to England. One of the survivors, by the name of William Strachey, composed an account of both the storm and the events that transpired on the island after they had crash landed thereon. News of their survival and this account reached England in around 1610. Shakespeare read this account and drew from it inspiration that served as the groundwork or the basis for some of the major plot points in this work, and also some of the thematic underpinnings that we'll be exploring. And through this first section of today's video, we're going to be looking at some of those issues. Now, in this true repertory of the wreck, or this true report or story of the wreck that was produced by one of the survivors of this crash, about 150 people survived. One of them went on to write this account of their experiences. In this account, William Strachey, a man who had survived on that island for about 10 months, described this initial storm that caused them to crash or to get caught up and dashed against the rocks and forced to survive on this island as a most direful tempest, their wrack on the Bermuda, and the description of those islands in his first chapter. So, Shakespeare, reading this account, already has this kind of resonance of the ideas and the images that will appear in this story. Because in the very first scene of the play, The Tempest, we have a ship that is traveling from Africa back home to Milan and to Naples, and the ship is caught up in this tremendous tempestuous storm. Right? The Tempest, that is the title of this work, and that derives from that first section of Strachey's account. During the tempest, the ship was beset, the storm clouds gathering thick upon us, and the winds sighing and whistling most unusually. A direful storm and hideous began to blow from out the northeast, with swellings and roarings. At length did beat all light from heaven. Shakespeare picks up on this idea of the music inside the storm, or the voices that could be heard in the grand tempest of the storm. He describes a kind of ominous singing. Trinculo says, as he walks through the island and thinks another storm is brewing in the context of the play, another storm brewing. I hear it sing in the wind. And later, Alonso expands on that metaphor when he says, Methought the billows spoke and told me of it. The winds did sing it to me. And the thunder, that deep and dreadful organ pipe, pronounced the name of Prosper. It did bass my trespass. So he's speaking of the sound of the storm rumbling in the distance, and it calls to mind his trespass, his betrayal of Prospero. We'll talk more about these characters and their relationships as we go on, but these are two characters inside the play who allude to the strange music of the island, the strange sounds produced by the storms that seem to echo the ideas presented in the true repertory of the wreck. Likewise, Ferdinand, one of the principal heroes of this text, goes on to say, as he is walking along the island believing that his father has died, where should this music be? The air or the earth? It sounds no more, and sure it waits upon some god of the island. Other kinds of similarities. Shakespeare read about ball lightning in the true repertory of the wreck. So as Strachey is describing the events that transpired during the storm, he said, an apparition of a little round light, like a faint star, trembling and streaming along with a sparkling blaze, half the height upon the mainmast, and shooting sometimes from shroud to shroud, assailed the ship. So ball lightning was this fanciful purported weather phenomenon wherein lightning didn't function as a bolt of lightning, but it functioned almost as an orb that would flit about randomly. And he said, we saw this ball lightning flitting about inside the sails, setting fire to them inside the storm that wrecked our vessel. In Act 1, Scene 1 of The Tempest, we have Ariel, this magical air nymph, assuming the form of ball lightning and attacking the mariner's ship. Of course, it's all an illusion. It's all a function of Prospero's magic. It's not real. But the image itself is one that is alluded to, or that is an allusion to what happened in Strachey's repertory of the wreck. Two other points of connection. In the true repertory of the wreck, Strachey says, it was not without his wonder whether it was the fear of death in so great a storm, or that it pleased God to be gracious unto us. There was not a passenger, gentleman, or other, after he began to stir and labor, but was able to relieve his fellows and make good his course. In other words, in the context of the storm that he's reporting upon, Everyone worked together in common cause, foregoing all the old animosities and bonds of class that defined them in the old world, and created a new kind of community based on mutuality, the need for survival in this direful moment. So all the boundaries and delineations of class were thrown to the side as all of them struggled in common cause. Every man and woman, passenger and gentleman or other, every base sailor and every gentleman together were working in common cause. In the play The Tempest, Shakespeare actually inverts this occurrence. All of the gentlemen that emerge on decks don't actually help events. They attempt to order men about and make demands of them to explain what's going on. Their behavior is actually a kind of disgrace to them. So those old bonds um, of class and the organizational structures of the old society that may not have place in the new world, let's say the new world of the colonies, are still in order. And the gentlemen in this story, the members of higher classes, come across as being petulant and foolish as a result. Strachey, in his report, also indicated that there were a number of mutinies in the course of their time spent on the islands of the Bermudas. Shakespeare picks up this idea of the overturning of social orders, mutinies against old social orders, the possibilities for new kinds of organizational structures in this new world in the series of mutinies or attempted mutinies that transpire in The Tempest. In many ways, this play is about the overturning of old orders and the possibilities for new kinds of social organizations and governmental systems and possibilities for communal organization in the new world. As Strachey puts it, these possibilities can inspire unnatural and destructive hubris, a striving to obtain more power for yourself now that the old orders that kept you in your place have been taken away. It can lead to a kind of rapacious greed for power or lust for power. Now, in Shakespeare, we have the same possibility that the idea of overturning old governmental systems that may not have been perfect can also lead to the dissolution of those very systems that keep us safe. So, what we have to take away from this is that the play itself, just like, well, Strachey, is very much concerned with social order and hierarchies and the possibilities and the dangers of overturning them. During these mutinies, one of them, or one of these mutineers, said that it was no breach of honesty, conscience, nor religion to decline the obedience of the governor, or refuse to go any further led by his authority, except it so pleased themselves, since that authority ceased when the wreck was committed, and with it they were all then freed from the government of any man. So what we have here is a representation of the new liberties that could possibly be wrested from the old orders in the new world. And yet, people, once they're free from these commitments, the demands of government and God and religion and conscience, are now free to do whatever they please. They're not constrained by any kind of social order or system of morality. Anarchy can only result, and possibly tyranny in order to restrain that anarchy and keep people safe. So the possibilities for a new world or the possibilities of a new world are pregnant with these kinds of dangers. And Shakespeare is going to explore all of this thematically in the context of his play. One of the central subjects of this work, or a motif in this work, is the interplay between harshness and tenderness, both on the level of character and setting itself. This too is indebted in some sense to Strachey and his account. As in the play, Prospero's life is saved by the island. He is cast adrift or set adrift in the story that he tells by his brother, left to die on the ocean. And he just happens upon this island that is his salvation. Now, Strachey and the survivors in the repertory of the wreck describe their islands in the same way. And yet, they play upon this idea, or they raise this idea of that generative union of contrasts, that somehow the island is both savior and devil, God and demon. It was a place of strangeness, salvation, and terror. Strachey said, quote, "The dangerous and dreaded islands of the Bermuda, because they be so terrible to all that ever touched on them, and such tempests, thunders, and other fearful objects are seen and heard about them, that they be called commonly the Devil's Islands. Yet it pleased our merciful God to make even this hideous and hated place both the place of our safety and means of our deliverance." Unquote. So, this new world can either be a heaven or hell. The new kinds of communities that we can create there, communities of free men that existed upon the sea venture, can either be wonderful egalitarian realms in which all men, regardless of their class, as these classes fade away, work together in common cause for survival and for common improvement, equalizing gentlemen and laborers in common humanity and purpose. It could be the tearing down of old social orders. It could be this place of salvation and deliverance as we enter into the new world, right, the Americas. Or it could be this demonic place wherein everything that we know falls apart, and without those old social orders, our humanity, in the sense of our animality, our vile, disgusting, and depraved inclinations that are covered over by a social order, might be allowed to come to the forefront. This play stages the interplay of harshness and tenderness, humanity and animality, as it asks a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human in the public realm or the public life of all the people around us, and in the private realm of our own homes? What does it mean to be a human being or an animal in the kinds of theatrical roles that we play? And in the end, it presents to us the idea that this seeming diametric opposition of, well, the demonic and the sort of prosperous and generous islands, right? The devil's islands sent to us by God, the animal and the human, the harsh and the tender, are not actually contraries. These seeming diametric opposites are in fact one and the same. They're mutually defining contraries that coexist, mingle, and commingle to the point of indistinguishability because they can't exist without the other, just as light cannot exist without darkness or darkness without light. The play presents us with the most elaborate and dense spectacle in Shakespeare's opus. In its day, when it was originally produced, it was an elaborate special effects fest. It was like the Marvel movies of Shakespeare's day, as fantastical mechanical contrivances were presented on stage, electronic devices or thunder generators or lightning machines were used to simulate the ball lightning in the opening spectacle of this Tempest. And yet, as the fireworks and cannons were going off to simulate thunder, as mechanical contrivances were used to raise and lower actors to simulate them appearing and disappearing at different points in the play. Despite all that, this play is also rife with some of Shakespeare's most subtle and moving and grandiose and extravagant prose, some of his most resplendent language. It's as if the play is staging this idea of the unitive or generative unification of contrasts. The play is in a kind of identity crisis, moving between harshness and tenderness, spectacle and subtlety. But it is Shakespeare at the height of his power. It is Shakespeare just at the moment that he is about to step off the stage for the last time. Like Prospero in the play, who uses his magic to stage the last great performance of his art before he dies, this old man just about ready to quit the stage, Shakespeare too is at the height of his power. On the basis of when Shakespeare could have read that letter, the account of the repertory of the wreck that so sparked his imagination and led to the creation of this play, we know that this is probably Shakespeare's final play. It was probably produced in the late fall of 1610 or 1611. Shakespeare would go on to die in 1616. He knows that his end as both a man and as a playwright are fast approaching. So he takes this moment to, like Prospero, present to us this final opus, this final commentary on the themes and the ideas that have governed him throughout his career. In the next series of videos, we're going to start breaking down the first section of the play and discussing the way in which these themes and these ideas begin to be expressed in the work itself.